Okay, hello. Thank you so much for joining us, and I'm so glad you're back with us, or perhaps this is the first time you've joined us. I'm Amanda Ellis. I'm Associate Commissioner over the Office of Teaching and Learning, and we are ready to get started. What we are doing is we are hosting this webcast to ensure that you have what you need to prepare for the academic needs of your students as they re-enter school in the fall. And that may seem a little early to do so, but it's just really not. There are so many needs that students are going to have when they enter, whether that be academic and or mental health needs that teachers will need to be prepared for, and ultimately be thinking proactively and forward thinking. What you're going to have today, the webcast resources will be a PowerPoint presentation and guidance documents. There will be found on the COVID-19 resources for educators and families. So definitely access those after you've watched this webcast or during that time. And then also for questions, please log into gosoapbox.com. Your access code is KDEOTL. And during that time, what you'll be able to do is ask questions of our staff throughout based on what you are experiencing, clarification questions, things that you would like a little bit more information about. This is no easy task. It's not something you're going to be able to do with you and your teammates or within your district for a day. It really takes time to think through the process of what you're doing, what you've already taught, what needs to be taught, and what is coming up. So that's a very methodical, process-based system that you and your colleagues are going to have to work through to prepare for your students. And so if you'll look at what our purpose is again, so due to our extended remote learning during the spring of 2020, the possible inequities may lead to gaps. And we know that's going to happen, that the learning environments for students are just not the same, especially since March 16th hit. And so we want to ensure that students have an understanding of grade level standards and how do we prepare for that and the gaps or the lack of instruction that they've received. You'll be hearing about stage one, creating an adjusted curriculum for the 2021 school year. And we're going to be deep diving into that process today and beginning that. And then stage two is using your formative assessment to inform instructional decisions. Lots of conversation have been going around as how will we know what they know and what they don't know in order to determine where we go from here. But it really has to start before that. And ultimately, what we want to promote is that your tier one instruction that's provided to all students every single day is solid, it is evidence-based, and it is aligned to our standards. We simply cannot put all students in intervention because there are gaps, especially our at-risk students. So we want our teachers to be prepared to serve their students every day in the classroom and then be able to determine what comes next and what learning has occurred. So I'm going to turn it over to my good friend and colleague, Jackie Rogers, to get us started. Thanks for joining.
Thank you, Amanda. And yes, thank you all for joining us as we begin this discussion. And we're going to really focus on stage one today. We did do an overview of the process in a different webcast, and we're going to continue on in other webcasts, but we're really going to focus on stage one, really thinking about this academic reentry. And the purpose of stage one is for grade level or course content teams to do certain things, such as analyze, identify potential gaps so they can get to this adjusted curriculum. So in that section A, where we're really going to put our time today, is all about analysis. So we're going to be looking at our 2019-20 curriculum and making adjustments moving toward next year's curriculum to try to address those potential knowledge gaps that we've been talking about that occurred because of remote learning. Now, section B, which is a part of our guidance, is around identification of those potential gaps and having a conversation vertically so that we can share what we've learned through our analysis so that we can get to section C, which is adjusting our curriculum for the upcoming year. And please know, and Amanda has said this already, we understand that we can put one slide together and say we've got these three sections and two stages, but we understand this is a heavy lift and there's a lot to analysis, for instance, and there's a lot to adjusting your curriculum. We get that part. We want to offer as much guidance as possible and possible process that you could use that could make this reentry as smooth as possible. So for today's purpose in stage one, we're really going to be focused on preparing for the work and we're going to really deep dive into Section A. Now, in Section A, when we're preparing for the work, we really have to think first about what resources are we going to need. This part's really important. We're going to look at action items later, but really understanding what we do need before we even get started, just to help expedite the process as it moves along. But one of the pieces would be the guidance document that we keep talking about. If everyone that's involved in the process had an individual copy, it would make this much simpler. We're going to be meeting in maybe some unusual ways. It's not unusual now. We've done a lot of virtual meeting, but it would be important for everyone to have the same guidance document as we move. Part of what they do will be individual, part will be with teams, but they'll need to all be able to share that same information. We're also going to need the 2019-20 local grade level curriculum for that content area. And also lesson plan book or calendar. We didn't exactly know what to title this one, because I know when I was a teacher, I used a lesson plan book for myself. I didn't necessarily have to turn that in, but I think we all keep track of what we've done, what we're going to have to maybe reteach, or some adjustments we have to make along the way. Those kind of documents can be very helpful as we're making this analysis of what happened in this past school year. And you're also going to need an electronic version of the Kentucky academic standards that are specific to the content area or course that you'll be working with, that teachers will be working with. Now, and some more preparation for stage one. And so this would be that front loading piece that would help teachers be prepared to get started, and hit the ground running. One would be to view the overview webcast. So we have links to those that would be very easy to get to that. But you know how important it is when we're considering, especially something that's a pretty difficult or time-consuming process, that we see that overview of where we're going and what our goals really are, what we're trying to accomplish, rather than just that one little step at a time. So viewing that can be very helpful. And also locating grade level standards and progressions or coherence statements inside the standards documents. Now I'm going to show you some examples from the standards documents. As we talked about progressions just briefly there, I want to make sure everyone's aware of exactly what we're talking about, how helpful this could be, because as we are thinking about analysis, the progressions in the standards or the coherence statements are going to be really important for folks to use as we're really considering exactly where we are and what needs to be taught at that particular grade level. We want to start with reading and writing because it's one of the easiest ones. It's the standards writers really made this clear. And when you take a look at their standards page in this view, you get to see these mini progressions. This would be a great place. For instance, this one is Reading Informational Standards 6, and the grade level standard that's under consideration here is number 4, which is in the middle. And so you would have what comes before to the left and what the grade after to the right. What also happens is we can really dig into the nuance of that standard. The more we understand and the deeper our understanding of our standards, the easier that analysis is going to be when we're trying to determine the things that we've done or that we plan to do, how closely and tightly aligned they are. Because if something falls outside of that, that could be an opportunity to move something, give us some more time because it fits somewhere else. So we just wanted to show you a couple of examples and also to note that these look different for each content area. So that's reading and writing. Let's take a look at math. So the math standards pages look very different than reading and writing as you would anticipate. And I know many of you are very familiar with all of these, but if we take a look at this page, what we notice if we're talking about progressions or coherence statements, you'll see that there are standards listed there in the standards for mathematical practices, but under the clarifications column is where you can find the coherence for math. And coherence gives us this opportunity to have this vertical alignment conversation where we're looking at connections in mathematics within and across grade levels. And these connections these are possible suggestions of what came before to build a foundation and where after this year we could go in the math standard. So those give some possible connections that teachers can use as they're thinking about the nuance of the math standards. Now, looking at social studies, we have something very different again. Social studies, their progressions are listed in an appendix. And by the way, in our guidance document, because we want things to be as simple as possible, we try to give links to as many things as possible because we want everyone to very easily to be able to click and go. It's another reason we would encourage teachers to use the electronic version of the CAS documents. You can see, looking at this table of contents for social studies, that there's a lot in there and how much easier it is if I want to look at progressions. Now, these are listed from kindergarten through high school, but if I wanted to look at a particular disciplinary strand, like in civics, and I wanted to really look at the progressions by grade level or perhaps a different disciplinary concept or practice, I can filter those in many different ways. I can look at just inquiry progressions and so forth. So that becomes essential to understand not only where those are, but how to use those as we begin this analysis process. So I just wanted to mention what those look like. And then we have science, which is looks very different itself, and the progressions there are really explained in a little different way. So these are articulation statements, and I hope you can see there at the bottom of the screen there's an arrow that points out the articulation of those disciplinary core ideas. And in that box, it names these other science topics that can either that show a foundation for student understanding. So we're talking about these progressions in those core ideas, or it builds on that foundation. So this standard helps build to things that come next. Now, something important to think about for science is in science, it doesn't necessarily go from one grade to the next in a really easy linear fashion, because sometimes students might not see the standard we're talking about. Maybe it was 2 grades back that they did that. That's going to have to be a consideration, or maybe they're not going to see the next standard in the next grade. So we have to really think about how we're approaching, for instance, science. So that articulation statement can be very important as they're making considerations about adjusting the upcoming curriculum. Now, in preparing for the work, we did want to show you this from the guidance document, because like I said, there are lots of links where you're able to go directly to the standards. And I know everyone can find those pretty easily, but we wanted to make it just as simple as possible. But if we're also talking about progressions, we want everyone to be able to find what they're looking for just at their fingertips. So we tried to also list page numbers where you can find explanations about the mini progressions or about the articulation statements or explanations. You can also find different kinds of progressions, and they're listed here, the kinds of views that you would see. So this could be a very helpful piece in that guidance document as well. We also always try to add some considerations. As we work through the process, we're thinking of this from a teacher's perspective, but we're also thinking from the leadership, what are some things that need to be considered as we are preparing and helping for them to be ready to work? First of all, it's what kind of meeting are we going to have, virtual or face-to-face? We haven't really talked a lot about face-to-face lately because we've been doing a lot of things virtually, and that's fine as well. But if there is a time and you're planning to do face-to-face, first of all, make sure you're looking at the health department, your local health department's regulations about face-to-face, but also to make some considerations if you're using virtual format of just the platform possibilities. I think it would be important to choose something and not maybe just say, hey, you all decide what you want to do, but maybe to give some guidance around those platforms as well. Also thinking about teacher course load. I was a high school English teacher. I taught 9th and 12th grade English almost my whole career. And so if I were doing this work, I'm going to have to work through more than one course. So I'm going to have to think about my 9th grade. I'm going to have to do that work there, have vertical conversations. And I'm also going to have to do this with 12th grade. I have to make an adjustment there as well and having conversations with those 11th grade teachers as well. So we want, and my appreciation as a teacher would be for my leadership to be able to protect that time so that I could work through all of that. It may be, we wouldn't want to forget that maybe an elementary teacher has got several different content areas to think about. So we want to be able to really think that through and protect that time so they can complete the work.
And so Jackie just walked us through kind of everything we would like for you to consider in preparing for the work. And again, all of that is found in the guidance document. But what we would like to spend the rest of the webcast doing is really walking you through stage 1, section A. Like they shared in the beginning, stage 1 is made up of 3 different sections. Section A probably is the most time intensive of all of the sections that we have, but really the work you're going to do here will help the section B and C go much smoother and much easier. So the bulk of the work is likely going to rest here in section A. So we really wanted to spend the time today walking you through these different pieces. So the purpose of section A is for the grade level or the course content team to come together and spend some time analyzing their 1920 curriculum so that they can find places where they could make adjustments to their 2021 curriculum in order to be able to address those potential knowledge gaps kids may come in with due to the extended remote learning. And so one of the things that in short, kind of quick synopsis of section A is this. Section A is all about really tightening up the grade level curriculum to ensure that it still includes what's required for students to meet the grade level expectations, but then also looking at where are those places that maybe is outside of that where we can make potential adjustments. That's what this section is all about. And section A actually consists of 3 different steps that the teachers would work through. And our goal was, like we've said before, we realized this would be a heavy lift on the teachers to do, but we truly believe that in doing this work, that we're setting our students up and the teachers in terms of having a plan in place for next school year to address these academic gaps. It's just going to make that transition back in the fall much smoother for everyone. So we want to just walk you through what would be entailed in each of these steps, give you some screenshots of what that might look like in the guidance document, as well as some considerations around each one. So section A, step 1. This is the only step that we have that we would recommend teachers complete individually. So in order to complete step 1, they're going to need their local grade level 1920 curriculum. And like Jackie mentioned earlier, this is the step where they're really going to want to have their lesson plan book, their calendar, wherever they kept a record of what they actually taught to the students this school year. So they need those pieces of information. And from that, what they're going to do in step 1 is individually, each teacher is going to list out all of the content, concepts, and skills that they taught that fall into the following 3 categories. They taught it prior to the extended remote learning. It was only taught during the extended remote learning, or it was in their 1920 curriculum, but they did not have the opportunity to teach it. So students had no exposure to those specific content, concepts, or skills. So it was in the curriculum, but it was not taught. Now, this is a screenshot of what the table looks like in step 1, where the teachers would individually list. And the reason we recommend they individually do this particular step is there could be slight variations of what teachers actually taught in their classrooms to their students this school year. So this just allows them to be able to put down everything that they taught to their students. Now, I will also tell you this. The reason the table is constructed into these 3 columns is we're going to keep coming back to table 1 over and over and over. So this table is also going to be extremely helpful when we get to section B, where they're identifying the gaps where they think students might potentially have gaps due to the extended remote learning moving into next school year. So it's set up intentionally this way to really think through all of the different pieces we're going to do. But step 1, they simply list out all of the content, concepts, and skills that were taught or not taught but was in their curriculum. Now, some considerations we have for the teachers when they're completing this step is we really recommend that you are as specific as possible in listing out the content, concepts, and skills. So try to avoid listing broad concepts or simply listing the standard coding. You really want, so for a couple of examples with this, so maybe you teach argumentative writing, but what were the specific content, concepts, and skills that you taught your students this year that fell into that topic of argumentative writing? Or another example, thinking about fractions. Don't just list the topic fractions, really break it down into what were the content, concepts, and skills that we taught the students that were a part of that fractions unit or that fractions topic, whatever the case may be. And again, the more explicit you are in step 1, the easier it's going to make the analysis that you will do in step 2. So step 1, they're just listing out exactly what they taught to their students that was in both in the classroom or something in the curriculum that they were not able to address. Now, step 2 is probably where there is the biggest lift on the teachers. This is the most in-depth step, and it's also the most critical step in all of this. Because remember, I'm just going to keep bringing you out to the big picture. Again, Section A is all about tightening up the grade level piece, the content that needs to go into the 2021 adjusted curriculum. So when they come to step 2, this is the point where we recommend they're coming back together as a grade level or a course content team, and they're going to work through the entire rest of this process of stage 1 together. So in step 2, they're really analyzing the content, concepts, and skills that they listed in table 1 for alignment to the Kentucky Academic Standards for their grade level. So in this particular step, they're going to use table 1 and they're going to need the Kentucky Academic Standards document. And we realize there is a lot of work within this step, so our goal was to try to at least provide directions that were as simple and specific as possible to make the process easy to do. So here's what we would recommend when they get to step 2. As a grade level or a course content team, they're going to sit down together, and for each standard for their grade level in that content area, they're going to do the following. They're going to read the standard. They're going to locate the progression or coherence statements for that standard, focusing on one grade level below and one grade level above, or like Jackie mentioned earlier, the last time it was taught and the next time it will be taught. Because here's where it's critically important. They're coming together as a grade level team, and that is with bullet 3, because they are going to examine and discuss the progression or coherence statements, because they're going to determine what is the absolute required content, concepts, and skills that students need in order to meet that grade level expectation associated with that particular standard. So just to meet it at this grade level, what absolutely do the students need in terms of those content, concepts, and skills? So the grade level team, they're going to come to consensus on that. So they're having this discussion, they reach consensus. Once they reach consensus, they go back to their table 1 and they are going to highlight any content, concepts, or skills from this school year that tightly align with that grade level standard and its expectation. And we recommend if you highlight something because it's tightly aligned, you know it's going to be kept in your 2021 adjusted curriculum, you may want to make a note at that point of the standard coding so you can remember which standard it connects back to. Now, one thing that we realize could happen as teachers are working through step 2 is they may look at a standard and they may really get into that discussion of the content, concepts, or skills that are required, and they look back at their table in the first step, and maybe that content, concept, or skill is not present in that table. So what we have done is we've put a table in step 2 where they're going to record any grade level content, concept, or skill that's in the CAS document necessary to meet the grade level expectation, but it's not in their table 1-1. Because again, that means it's absolutely necessary to keep in the 2021 curriculum for students to meet the grade level expectations. And once again, if you record something in that second table, we would recommend that you include that standard coding for later use. So that's step 2. Now with step 2, we have a couple of teacher considerations as well as some leadership considerations, because again, this is where the heaviest lift is on the teachers. So for the teachers, we really want you to think about the more in depth you do this curriculum analysis, the more places you're going to find for potential adjustments that you can make to the 2021 curriculum to address those potential knowledge gaps from the extended remote learning. And what you're likely going to find is once you've gone through the standards, you've highlighted everything tightly aligned, there are likely going to be some things in table 1 that you did not highlight. And those are places for possible adjustments in your 2021 curriculum. And those are going to include content, concepts, or skills that likely fall into one of 2 categories. They either extend outside the grade level standards, or they fall before the grade level expectation. In that first one, when we are thinking about extending outside the grade level standard, that could be because actually some of the content, concepts, and skills that you taught this year actually reach into the next grade level and what they're supposed to do with the standard. Or it could be extending outside in terms of it's not tightly aligned, it may be outside the realm of your grade level standards. And please know that we recognize this. Every year, and I was a classroom teacher for 10 years, every year we add to and enrich the academic experience for our students in the classroom. And we do maybe include things that were beyond the scope of the standards. And in a given academic year, we have both the time and the flexibility to include some of those pieces. But we're in a unique situation, and the 2021 school year may not allow for us to include some of those pieces. Now, the other situation was it could be that you look at some content, concepts, or skills that you didn't highlight that actually fall into what the previous grade level should be doing with that standard. And for this section A, it's all about tightening up the grade level piece to ensure that what we're putting over in the 2021 curriculum is absolutely necessary for students to meet those grade level requirements. Now, connecting back to something Amanda said earlier about formative assessment, when you go through next school year, you're using formative assessment data, you're gathering that pre-assessment data. It may be that when you're really assessing around those areas where kids could have potential knowledge gaps, that maybe they're further along than you even anticipated, and you're able to add back in some of these pieces that you don't have highlighted in table 1. But for now, it's really making sure that we're in looking at any adjustments we can make to include time to address those potential gaps. The one leadership consideration we have here is you want to consider possibly including some content specialists that can assist your teachers as they go through this work. Different teachers in different schools and districts are going to have various comfort levels and familiarity with the standards document. We recognize that a lot of you were planning on using this spring and this summer to dig into those standards documents. So this analysis may take more time for some teachers depending upon their knowledge level around those new standards documents. So what you could do to assist them in the work is maybe think about how could you utilize your instructional specialists and coaches that are at your school or in your district? Or do you even have some content experts that are a part of your district staff or your school leadership staff that could assist teachers through this? And then you could also think about outside your school or district, how could maybe co-ops work with you on this? And I'll tell you, we shared this with the co-ops last week, and they are already thinking about how can they support schools and districts as they do this work. So maybe you could connect to their content specialists and see if they could support your teachers, or even people in your regional professional organizations. So again, just a big leadership thing we would like for you to consider is in terms of how might you support teachers in this work. Now, step 3. Step 3 is really about consolidating the work that you did in step 1 and 2 to really determine the grade level content for your 2021 adjusted curriculum. So again, still working in that grade level or course team together, what they're going to do is they're going to take the items that they highlighted in table 1 and what they put in table 2 that was in the CAS document but wasn't in their table 1, and they're going to combine that together into one table in step 3 that will represent what must be included in the 2021 curriculum for students to meet grade level expectations. This is a screenshot from that guidance document. And as you can see, the first column is for everything that they taught this school year that was still tightly aligned to the grade level standards. They record it there. The second column is the items that they recorded in step 2 that were in the CAS, but not in their curriculum that they know they need to add in. And again, this represents what must go in the 2021 adjusted curriculum for students to meet those grade level expectations. We recommend that as teachers, once you complete this table, that you go back through and do a double check and see, are all of the standards for the grade level in this content area included in table 3? Now, we do have a couple of considerations for teachers doing this step. And it might be that they just want to create one master copy of table 3. So each individual teacher may not necessarily want to make their own. It's they're coming together, they make one master copy of this particular table. But what's critically important is anything that gets recorded in table 3, that there is team consensus on including that as being necessary for students to meet the requirements of the grade level expectations. So that is really section A. And that was a ton of information that we just threw at you, and we know that. It's really about, again, taking stock of what we did this year, seeing what's tightly aligned to the grade level standards to keep in our adjusted curriculum next year. And again, making note of maybe a couple of things we need to include that was in the CAS but not in ours, so that we now at this point have what's necessary for the grade level piece. In our next webcast, we're going to dig much deeper into section B and C, where teachers are identifying where they anticipate the gaps being for their students around particular content, concepts, and skills, and then drafting that adjusted curriculum. And we're just going to offer some considerations when you're drafting those at the local level. So at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Jackie, because Jackie's going to walk you through some possible action steps that you might want to consider taking based on what you heard today before that next webcast.
Thank you, Misty. So we always like to leave you with some things to think about that maybe could be next steps, and so some action items. And the first one that we're going to talk about is personnel. So really thinking about who's available and identifying the individuals that may provide content support to teacher teams. Sometimes that's an instructional coach or an instructional supervisor. That sounds very logical, but I know that each district and each school has its own teachers and other folks with strengths that can provide that content support. For instance, I have, when I worked in a certain high school, I had a principal who was also a math teacher who would have been a great resource to work with the teacher teams as they were going through that process. Also, you want to think about team leads. Who's going to be the point of contact and also to guide that grade level course content work, to be able to talk with with leadership, to understand what's expected, how all the pieces are going to fit together, but also to lead that work. Another action item is thinking about resources. We mentioned earlier about space, making considerations about, is this face-to-face? Is it virtual? If so, where's it going to happen? What kind of platform we're going to use? And the materials that will be necessary for teachers to have. So letting them know everything that they're going to need prior. We mentioned quite a few of those. Available time that's coming up, that could be teacher work days or maybe professional learning days, that are going to give them time to prepare and to do this grade level analysis so that they can build this adjusted 2020-2021 curriculum. So just some things to consider. I think we have some questions, perhaps. I got a message about that.
Yes, Jackie, we do have a couple, and here's one for you and Misty to weigh in on. I was just wondering, what is advised for a starting point after meeting vertically with teams?
I think one thing that I would recommend is, especially based on what we shared today, had they done the grade level analysis piece. So if they already have that information from the previous grade level, you're probably going to see that what we talk about next week, they've done some of that work, but really thinking about, did they do this grade level analysis piece? And so without having more information, that would be my recommendation is now, before they really create the adjusted curriculum, do the grade level analysis, then use that information from the vertical conversation to do what we're going to lay out within section C. Jackie, would you add anything to that?
No, I think that would cover it, but I do see another question that's in the chat box. How should we treat high school courses?
Yes, and that one is actually, how should we treat high school courses that are elective, such as pre-calculus, that don't necessarily lead to another course later and are optional for students? And so I'll go ahead and start with that one, and then if anybody has anything else to weigh in on that. You know, in this particular example with pre-calculus, if you've got a junior who particularly has taken that course, then looking to what, looking within the department of what courses are going to be available for them to take their senior year, where you can address those skills that maybe weren't going to be able to be addressed when they took that course originally. And some of that will occur through formative assessment to see what those needs are, because in this particular example, you're wanting to make sure that they are prepared to go on beyond high school with that. Any other feedback from our team on how you might address the electives?
No, Krista, I agree. I think what you said is spot on.
And then we have several other comments. Thank you, Misty. We have several other comments, and one is a comment. It says several questions were posed during the last session about instructional time that could be made up by reducing or eliminating high stakes year-end tests and so much interim benchmarking. In-class formative assessment is always best. And then there were another one about state assessment. I know it was talked about some in the last webinar, but I was wondering if there were any updates on how state testing may be adjusted due to these gaps. Amanda, would you want to address that?
Yeah, sure. So this question also popped up in our superintendent webcast as well. That is ultimately a federal government decision. As you all know, that there are requirements with ESSA that when we have to assess, and that's linked to funding for our schools. So at this point, we have not heard any feedback about that from USAID. At this point, they're still working on the CARES funding and getting relief out to the states to disseminate to districts, but we will keep you informed. But that really is not a state level, excuse me, decision. That would be a federal decision on how they would guide states to apply for a waiver if that's even available. So we just haven't heard anything about that at this time. But of course, formative assessment is also always very helpful. It's in real time. You can address the learning, and obviously a great practice, which you noticed that we'll be talking about that soon, the different types of assessment, the different ways to assess learning. So to that point, we just don't have any further information from USAID at this point.
Thank you, Amanda. I think I've got a couple more for you, Amanda, around social, emotional, and mental health learning. So first, will there be specific guidance and or a webcast on mental health and social emotional learning for re-entry planning?
Yeah, so great question. So one of the things about reentry is that it is not easy and it is not simple. So what we're doing currently right now at KDE with cross-office collaboration and other partners is that we are creating a reentry plan. As you know, the governor said yesterday he would like the districts to consider a plan for possibly starting early, starting at a traditional time, or starting later. Well, that's not just starting school. There are logistics around that depending on what phase we're in of the pandemic and what's allowed. So there's logistic logistics around transportation and how many kids can be in a classroom, and do we have to do NTI or a hybrid? Lots of questions around that. The other piece is academics, which is exactly what we're providing for you now. How do you prepare for those kids walking in? How do you prepare for the gaps that they may have, or just the lack of exposure to specific standards and instruction, which is what we're trying to do on this end right now, in a piece of the bigger puzzle. And then the other component that is not a last but least, but it is a major component, which is the mental health and well-being of our students and our staff. We absolutely acknowledge that the learning environment for students have been extremely varied. As you can imagine, I know you probably have concerns over some of your students' safety, the trauma they may have experienced in the home. Many of your students, as I said earlier, may be the caregivers for their younger siblings. Lots of things to consider. So I will tell you, there are a lot of resources that are already up, and Dr. Damian Sweeney has already hosted several webinars about social emotional learning and mental health. If you look at our COVID-19 webpage, the KDE, the KDE COVID-19 webpage, I apologize. Click on teaching and learning, you will see virtual counseling. If you click on the virtual counseling, it will give you all the links to the resources. I know probably many of your districts are getting lots and lots and lots of requests from vendors to take advantage of their resources. What we have posted, I think, are all pretty much free and vetted at the national level and by our counselors. So there's SEL lessons, there are resources. There are also resources specifically for students, for staff, and for families. And I don't think we can overlook any of those populations because they all have to play in together. And we just don't know what the level of anxiety will be, what type of mental health conditions everyone will be in, whether that be our staff, our students, whatever that may be, and how to best prepare. So those resources are already available online. Dr. Damian Sweeney continues to contribute. So he is working with folks at CHFS, the Cabinet for Health and Family Services, to create resources that he is sharing now with advisories to get feedback on that will actually go into the reentry plan. And that reentry framework will help districts actually think through each component and make a plan for reentry on whatever that may look like. And the hard part of that right now is as superintendents are really struggling to decide what to do next, how to plan, how to prepare the staff, how to prepare financially for that. There are just a lot of unknowns. So we are really trying to put together the best framework we can using national resources and local resources to give a one-stop place just for considerations as districts make these really tough decisions, especially with a lot of unknowns and changing rules. And so we will constantly update as needed. And Krista, I know that was a really long answer to a short question, but it's not a quick fix. It's not a quick answer. So thanks for giving me that chance.
Yeah, definitely it's not. And really, to follow up on that, there was a comment that simply stated that districts should be very careful to properly vet those SEL type programs, making sure that they are meeting their needs and that they're,
Absolutely.
not just, being sold for those profit concerns. So
absolutely.
Jackie and Misty, it looks like we have a question. Our teacher work days begin Monday, May 11th. How soon can we get access to the Stage 2 document?
For Stage 2, that work will be coming out later in the summer, specifically in July and August. So really, when you look at Stage 1, that was work that we saw taking place prior to the start of the school year, having this big plan in place based on kind of mapping out the curriculum. But Stage 2 is that day-to-day piece once they're back into the classroom or back into instruction. So we will roll that guidance out beginning in July.
Perfect, thank you. Now we have a couple math questions. So the first one, just wondering how you would suggest the high school teachers utilize the high school math matrix standards by course 2019-2020. Would it be a beneficial piece to utilize? And then the second part says, yes, high school math doesn't really have the progression links like the other grades. And so we have talked in depth about how this does look different for different grade bands, whereas elementary, you're feeding into the next grade level, but in high school, every student isn't necessarily feeding into the next course. And so how that will look with teachers when they follow into that next course. So specifically back to the math matrix standards, when looking at that course, you could use that document to help identify what standards in your school you had applied to each of the courses. So with that matrix documents, there are some standards that could have been placed in a different math course, depending on whether you went with an integrated pathway or you went with a traditional pathway. So using that matrix document would help you know what standards you had intended to be taught during the 2019-2020 year, but you still have to go back and actually identify what truly was taught, and were there things that weren't able to be addressed during the extended remote learning time. And that, when we look at the part about the progression links for the other grades, that will be a department part of that department work when your PLC comes together, really looking to see, are there pieces that were not able to be, or are there concepts, content, or skills that weren't necessarily addressed in this current year that the next year would either need to embed within their content or particularly front load with that way. Now, another question that we have says, for section BC of what we had talked about today, I'm interested to hear how those of us in the museum cultural attraction sector can help support teachers and students. And I think you did a great job of answering your question. You said perhaps working with educational cooperatives would be the best strategy. And our educational cooperatives are an excellent resource for our educators in the region. So that would be a perfect place to reach out to for that, most definitely. We also had a comment, someone just thanking us for the easy access to the guidance documents, because we did post those on the COVID-19 page prior to this today, as well as posting them in the Go Soapbox for folks to reference. So someone just asked the question, where is the guidance document you keep referring to? So in the Go Soapbox, that link is at the very top, I believe, if you scroll up, but also on the KDE COVID-19 page under the teaching and learning resources. It is going to be located there. The other thing is we are going to send it out right after this webcast with a link to the archived video, as well as a link to the PowerPoint and the guidance document. That will be included as well. I'm trying to see if I've missed any questions. Okay, I don't think I do. If you have any last minute questions you want to enter, we can answer those before we sign off today. Okay, Jackie or Misty, do you want to give us the our update on the information for next week's webcast?
I could do that. So for May 13th webcast, again at 2 o'clock Eastern time, we are going to be talking about section B and C. So we're going to focus on this process for identifying the potential gaps and having that vertical conversation and using all of this analysis and identification to help draft that adjusted curriculum for 2020-21 for that school year. That's an
Amanda, Chris said that's all we had. Amanda, did you have anything else that you wanted to add before we wrapped it up today?
The only thing I want to say is thanks for everyone for tuning in, of course, and I will say it again because it helped last week. If you have not already tuned in to your kystandards.org, please do that. It is the easiest way to find all of our resources that align with standards and help you to determine best practices. all you have to do is go to the website, kystandards.org. On the top left-hand corner, there's a plus sign. You can sign into that and you will get reminders in your email. So if you're busy like the rest of us, and I think you're just might be a little bit busy, you will have reminders of webcasts that are coming up and any new resources that are posted. But we appreciate everyone tuning in, and we hope to see you next week. So Misty and Jackie, back to you.
That's all I wanted to say too, was thank you for tuning in and for having such great concern and working so hard to make sure that students have a really smooth reentry to school. And we appreciate you joining us, and we'll see you next week.